Earl Thompson's weathered hands trembled as he stared at the hospital bill, $47,000 glowing in harsh fluorescent light. The coffee cup slipped from his grip, shattering against the linoleum floor. It wasn't just a pimple. It was evidence of a 43-year corporate lie. Martha's scream echoed down the hallway as nurses rushed past, their footsteps thundering like the mining equipment that had stolen her father's health. The antiseptic smell mixed with Earl's memories of coal dust and broken promises. He remembered Rose's gentle fingers tracing the same spot on his back where she'd kissed him goodbye each morning before his shift. Now that innocent bump had become their family's nightmare, a wound that cut deeper than any mining accident ever could. "Get Dr. Chen immediately!" Martha's voice cracked with desperation and fury. Who else knew what Millbrook Mining had buried along with their safety reports? And how many other families would pay the price for corporate greed before the truth finally surfaced from the depths? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Earl Thompson had been a different man. At 76, he still rose before dawn in his modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street, the same routine he'd followed for over half a century. The American flag on his front porch caught the first light, a symbol of the values that had shaped his life: hard work, loyalty, and taking care of your own. Earl's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug as he sat in Rose's old rocking chair, watching the sun creep over the West Virginia mountains. 3 years had passed since lung disease claimed his beloved wife, but he still made coffee for 2 out of habit. The empty cup sat across from him like a ghost at the breakfast table, a daily reminder of the woman who'd shared 48 years of his life. "Morning, Rose," he whispered to the faded photograph on the mantel. "Another day above ground is a good day." The house held echoes of their life together. Rose's china cabinet with the good dishes they'd saved for special occasions, the worn carpet where their children had taken first steps, the kitchen window where she'd watched him leave for the mines every morning for 43 years. Earl had paid off the mortgage with his final pension check, determined to leave Martha something of value when his time came. Millbrook, West Virginia, population 847, bore the scars of economic decline like an old soldier's wounds. Main Street stretched 6 blocks, half the storefronts empty, their windows papered with faded "For Lease" signs. The Millbrook Diner still served coffee and gossip, and Doc Harrison's clinic remained open 3 days a week. But the heart of the town, Millbrook Mining Company, had closed its doors in 2008, taking with it the dreams and livelihoods of 3 generations. Earl's daily routine never varied. After coffee, he tended Rose's garden, keeping her tomatoes and roses alive through sheer stubborn determination. "A man's got to have purpose," he'd tell himself, pulling weeds with the same methodical precision he'd once used to operate mining equipment a mile underground. His daughter Martha visited every Sunday, bringing casseroles and worry in equal measure. At 48, she carried the weight of a failed marriage and twin teenagers while working double shifts as a nurse at Charleston General Hospital, 90 miles away. Earl saw his late wife in Martha's caring nature and her stubborn refusal to accept help, even when she clearly needed it. "Dad, you're too isolated out here," she'd argue during their weekly dinners. "What if something happens? I've got neighbors, I've got my health, and I've got my pride," Earl would respond, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd survived cave-ins and black lung scares. "That's more than most folks my age can say." The irony wasn't lost on him now, sitting in that sterile hospital room. Pride, it turned out, could be a man's greatest enemy. The same stubbornness that had kept him working underground when others quit, that had helped him build a life from nothing, had also prevented him from seeking help when he needed it most. Late March arrived in Millbrook with the kind of false spring that fooled daffodils into blooming too early. Earl stood in his cramped bathroom, steam rising from the shower as he toweled off his weathered frame. 43 years of mining had left their mark. Shoulders permanently hunched from crouching in low tunnels, hands gnarled from gripping equipment, lungs that wheezed on humid days despite never smoking a cigarette in his life. As he reached for his undershirt, Earl's fingers brushed against something unfamiliar on his back, just below his right shoulder blade. A small bump, firm and slightly raised, sat exactly where his mining helmet strap had rubbed for decades. He twisted awkwardly, trying to get a better look in the cracked mirror that had served him and Rose for 30 years. "Just getting old, Earl," he muttered to his reflection. "Nothing a man of 76 hasn't earned." The bump was no bigger than a pencil eraser, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. Earl had seen plenty worse on his mining buddies over the years: scars from equipment accidents, growths that came and went, the inevitable wear and tear of men who'd spent their lives underground. This felt different somehow, harder than the cysts he'd had removed years ago, but Earl pushed the thought away. Rose had always accused him of being a worrier about everything except his own health. For 3 weeks, Earl ignored the bump completely. It didn't hurt, didn't itch, didn't interfere with his daily routine of coffee, gardening, and evening news. He told himself it would disappear on its own, the way most minor ailments did if you gave them time and didn't fuss over them. But the bump had other plans. By mid-April, it had grown to the size of a dime, developing a rough surface that caught on his undershirts. Earl found himself unconsciously reaching back to touch it, the way a person might worry a loose tooth. The sensation disturbed him more than he cared to admit. It felt foreign, like something that didn't belong on his body. Standing in the pharmacy aisle at Miller's General Store, Earl studied the array of over-the-counter remedies with the same methodical approach he'd once used to diagnose equipment problems underground: hydrocortisone cream for inflammation, antibiotic ointment for infections, even a drawing salve that promised to bring stubborn bumps to a head. He selected the most expensive option, figuring you got what you paid for, and paid in cash to avoid questions from chatty clerk Sally Henderson. Home doctoring, he called it, applying the cream twice daily after his shower. Rose would have scolded him for being foolish, would have marched him to Doc Harrison's clinic the moment she'd spotted the bump. But Rose wasn't there to fuss over him, and Earl had learned to handle problems on his own. The self-treatment ritual became part of his routine. Each morning and evening he'd stand before the bathroom mirror, contorting to reach the spot that seemed to grow more prominent each day. The cream made his skin greasy, leaving stains on his undershirts that reminded him of the oil stains he'd carried home from the mines. May brought warmer weather and Martha's increasing concern. She'd developed a mother's intuition about her father's well-being, probably from years of nursing, and Earl could feel her studying him during their Sunday dinners. "You're favoring your right side, Dad," she observed one afternoon as they sat on the front porch, watching her twins play catch in the yard. "Something bothering you?" "Getting old ain't for sissies," Earl deflected with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just a kink in my back from sleeping wrong." But Martha's trained eye caught details Earl thought he'd hidden: the way he shifted in his chair to avoid pressure on his back, how he reached for his coffee cup with his left hand instead of his right, the slight wince when he stood up after sitting too long. "Let me take a look," she offered, her voice carrying the professional authority of someone who'd spent 25 years examining patients. "I've seen plenty of backs in my time." "I'm fine, Martha Ann." Earl used her full name the way he had when she was 16 and trying to stay out past curfew. "Don't go making something out of nothing." The conversation ended there, but Earl could see the worry lines deepening around his daughter's eyes. That night, he stood longer than usual before the bathroom mirror, studying the bump that had grown to nearly quarter size. The drawing salve had only made it angrier looking, the surface now mottled with areas that looked almost black in the harsh bathroom light. Deep down in the part of his mind where he stored uncomfortable truths, Earl knew this wasn't something that would resolve itself with drugstore remedies, but admitting that would mean admitting he needed help, would mean burdening Martha with another worry when she already carried too many. It would mean facing the possibility that his body, which had served him faithfully through decades of dangerous work, might finally be failing him when he needed it most. Late May's heat had settled over Millbrook like a heavy blanket, and Earl's tomato plants were already showing promise of a good harvest. He'd been working in Rose's garden since sunrise, trying to get the weeding done before the afternoon sun made it unbearable. The bump on his back had become a constant irritation now, catching on his shirt every time he bent over, but he'd learned to work around it. Martha wasn't supposed to visit until Sunday, so when her Honda Civic pulled into his gravel driveway at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, Earl knew something was wrong. She climbed out of her car with the purposeful stride he remembered from her teenage years when she'd set her mind on something he wouldn't like. "Dad, we need to talk," she called across the yard, her voice carrying that tone nurses used when they meant business. Earl straightened slowly, his back protesting the movement. "If this is about me moving to one of those retirement communities, you can save your breath. I told you, it's not about that." Martha had reached him now, close enough to see the sweat staining his shirt, the way he held his right arm slightly away from his body. "Jake called me at work. Said he tried to reach you 3 times this morning and got no answer." "Phone's working fine," Earl lied. The truth was, he'd been screening calls all week, avoiding the church committee that wanted him to volunteer for the bake sale and the insurance salesman who'd been pestering him about supplemental coverage. "Sometimes I just don't feel like talking." Martha studied his face with the clinical assessment that made her such a good nurse. "You look pale, Dad, and you're moving like something hurts." "I'm 76 years old, Martha Ann. Everything hurts." Earl turned back toward the house, hoping to end the conversation, but his daughter wasn't easily deterred. "When's the last time you ate a real meal? Not just coffee and toast?" The question hit closer to home than Earl cared to admit. His appetite had been off for weeks, nothing tasting quite right, his stomach feeling unsettled more often than not. He'd attributed it to the heat, maybe eating too much of his own cooking. But standing there under Martha's concerned gaze, he realized how much weight he'd lost. "I eat plenty," he said, but even to his own ears the protest sounded weak. Martha followed him toward the house, her nursing instincts in full gear now. "Dad, you're scaring me. You won't answer your phone. You look like you've lost 15 pounds, and you're moving like—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she noticed the dark stain spreading across the back of his work shirt. "Dad!" Her voice had gone very quiet, the way it did when she was trying not to panic her patients. "Turn around." "It's nothing," Earl said quickly, but Martha was already moving, her hands reaching for his shirt. "Just a little irritation from—" "Turn around. Now." The authority in her voice was absolute, and Earl found himself obeying despite every instinct telling him to run. Martha lifted the back of his shirt, and the sound she made, part gasp, part sob, told him everything he'd been trying not to acknowledge for 2 months. "Oh, Dad. Oh, dear God." The wound had progressed far beyond what Earl had been able to see in his bathroom mirror. What had started as a simple bump had become an angry, festering mass the size of a silver dollar, with irregular edges and a surface that looked like raw meat. The smell that rose from it made Martha step back, her hand covering her nose and mouth. "We're going to the clinic, right now. Martha, I don't think—" "Right now, Dad." No arguments, no delays, no, "I'll think about it." Get in the car. The drive to Doc Harrison's clinic took 12 minutes, during which Martha's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. Earl sat in the passenger seat, feeling more vulnerable than he had since Rose's funeral, watching his daughter's profile as she fought to maintain her professional composure. "How long?" she asked finally. "Couple months. Started small." "Why didn't you tell me?" Earl stared out the window at the familiar streets of his hometown, the empty storefronts and abandoned lots that told the story of Millbrook's decline. Didn't want to worry you. Figured it would clear up on its own. Dad, you're not 20 anymore. Things don't just clear up on their own at your age. Doc Harrison's clinic occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, its paint peeling and front steps sagging slightly. Doctor. Sarah Mitchell, the young resident who'd taken over when Doc Harrison retired, worked 3 days a week serving Millbrook and 2 neighboring towns. She was barely 30, with kind eyes and gentle hands that reminded Earl of his late wife. Martha handled the check-in process while Earl sat in the waiting room, surrounded by outdated magazines and the antiseptic smell that all medical facilities seemed to share. 3 other patients waited ahead of him. Mrs. Kowalski with her chronic arthritis, young Tommy Peters with what looked like a broken wrist, and old Pete from the hardware store wheezing with the same lung problems that plagued half the former miners in town. When Dr. Mitchell finally called his name, Earl's legs felt unsteady as he stood. Martha rose to follow him, but he held up his hand. I can handle this part myself. The examination room felt smaller than he remembered from his last visit 2 years ago for his annual physical. Doctor. Mitchell's demeanor shifted the moment she saw the wound, her usual cheerful bedside manner replaced by professional concern. Mr. Thompson, how long has this lesion been present? Couple months, maybe more. She photographed the wound from multiple angles, her movements careful and deliberate. Have you noticed any changes in size, color, or texture? It's gotten bigger, and it smells. Dr. Mitchell nodded, making notes on her chart. Mr. Thompson, this isn't something you can treat with over-the-counter remedies. We need to get you to a specialist immediately. The words Earl had been dreading finally hung in the air between them. He'd known, somewhere deep in his heart, that this day would come. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified him. What kind of specialist? A dermatologist. There's an excellent one at Charleston Medical Center, Dr. Rebecca Chen. I'm going to call and try to get you an appointment this week. What about the cost? Dr. Mitchell paused in her note-taking, her expression softening. Let's worry about getting you seen first, then we'll figure out the rest. Your Medicare should cover the consultation. But Earl knew better. He'd lived through Rose's illness, had seen how quickly medical bills could consume a lifetime of savings. At 76, with a modest pension and Social Security, he was one major illness away from losing everything he'd worked to build. Doctor, he said quietly, just tell me straight. What do you think this is? Dr. Mitchell met his eyes directly, and in that moment Earl saw his worst fears confirmed. Mr. Thompson, I think you need to see that specialist as soon as possible, and I think you need to bring your daughter with you. The drive to Charleston Medical Center took 2 hours through winding mountain roads that Earl had traveled countless times during his mining days. Martha gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles while Earl stared out the passenger window, watching familiar landmarks blur past. The Kanawha River snaked alongside the highway, its muddy waters reflecting the gray June sky that seemed to mirror his mood. Dr. Rebecca Chen's office occupied the 4th floor of a gleaming medical complex that made Millbrook's modest clinic look like a country store. At 32, she possessed the confident demeanor of someone who'd graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins, yet her eyes held the compassion that came from treating patients rather than textbooks. Her examination room smelled of latex gloves and disinfectant, a sterile environment that made Earl's skin crawl. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to need you to remove your shirt so I can examine the lesion properly. Doctor, Chen said, washing her hands with methodical precision. Your daughter mentioned it's been present for several months? Earl's weathered fingers fumbled with his shirt buttons, his hands shaking slightly. Martha started to help, but he waved her away with stubborn pride that seemed foolish now in the face of medical necessity. When he finally managed to expose his back, Dr. Chen's sharp intake of breath told him everything he needed to know. The examination took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Dr. Chen photographed the wound from multiple angles, measured its dimensions, and took a small tissue sample that made Earl wince despite the local anesthetic. Her questions came in rapid succession: family history, occupational exposure, previous skin problems, changes in appetite or weight. "Mr. Thompson, I need to be direct with you," Dr. Chen said finally, pulling off her gloves and meeting his eyes. "This appears to be malignant melanoma, and based on its size and characteristics, it's been developing for quite some time. We'll need pathology results to confirm, but I want to schedule you for staging scans immediately." The words hit Earl like a cave-in, that sudden crushing weight that left him unable to breathe. Martha's hand found his shoulder, her touch gentle but trembling. Melanoma. Cancer. The disease that had taken his brother-in-law 5 years ago, eating him alive from the inside out until there was nothing left but bones and regret. "What are we looking at, doctor?" Martha's voice carried the professional steadiness of someone accustomed to delivering bad news, but Earl could hear the fear underneath. "Treatment options, prognosis?" Dr. Chen consulted her notes, her expression carefully neutral. "That depends on staging. If it's localized, we're looking at surgical excision with possible lymph node removal. If there's metastasis," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." The financial discussion that followed made Earl's stomach churn worse than the diagnosis. The staging scans alone would cost $8,000. Surgery could run anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000 depending on complexity. Chemotherapy, if needed, would add tens of thousands more to the bill. "My Medicare should cover most of this, right?" Earl asked, though he already suspected the answer from Martha's expression. "Medicare covers 80% of approved treatments," Dr. Chen explained gently. "But there are deductibles, co-pays, and not all procedures may be fully covered. I'd recommend speaking with our financial counselor before we proceed." 20 minutes later, Earl sat across from Janet Morrison, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who'd clearly had this conversation too many times before. Her calculator clicked steadily as she ran through various scenarios, each one more financially devastating than the last. "Your Medicare Part B will cover the consultation and basic treatments," she explained. "But your estimated out-of-pocket costs for comprehensive treatment could range from $20,000 to $40,000, depending on the staging results and treatment plan." Earl's modest savings account held $12,000. His emergency fund built penny by penny over 43 years of careful living. His monthly pension and Social Security provided enough for basic living expenses, but barely. The house was paid off, but it was his only real asset, and at 76, he had no prospects for increasing his income. "What about payment plans?" Martha asked, though Earl could see the calculation running in her head. Her own financial situation was precarious enough without taking on her father's medical debt. "We offer 12-month payment plans for qualified applicants," Janet said, but her tone suggested Earl's fixed income wouldn't qualify him for much. "There are also charity care programs, though the waiting lists are quite long." The drive home passed in heavy silence. Earl watched the mountains roll past, their ancient peaks unchanged while his world crumbled around him. Martha's jaw was set in the determined line he remembered from her childhood when she'd decided to tackle some impossible task through sheer force of will. "We'll figure it out, Dad," she said finally as they pulled into his driveway. "I can mortgage my house, use the equity to cover your treatment." "Absolutely not." Earl's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent 43 years making difficult decisions underground. "You've got Jake and Emma to think about. College expenses coming up. I won't have you sacrificing their futures for an old man's problems. Dad, you're not just an old man. You're my father." That evening, Earl sat at his kitchen table surrounded by medical bills from Rose's final illness, their edges yellowed with age but their totals still painfully clear. $67,000 over 18 months, eating through their retirement savings like acid through metal. He'd promised Rose he'd fight for her, would spare no expense, and he'd kept that promise even when it meant mortgaging their future. Now, facing his own mortality, Earl wondered if he had the strength or the right to put his family through that ordeal again. The phone rang at 9 o'clock, interrupting his brooding. Martha's voice was steady but determined. "Dad, I've been doing research online. There are other cases like yours, other miners with similar symptoms. This isn't random, it's occupational exposure." Earl's blood chilled. He'd suspected as much for weeks, remembering the other men from his crew who'd developed unusual skin problems in recent years. Tommy Kowalski had died last fall, officially from a heart attack, but Earl remembered the angry lesions on his arms. Joe Martinez had moved to Arizona, claiming the dry climate helped his skin condition. "How many others, Martha?" "I've found at least a dozen cases just from internet searches. All former Millbrook mining employees, all diagnosed with aggressive skin cancers in the last 5 years. Dad, I think the company knew something and covered it up." The implication hit Earl like a physical blow. 43 years he'd descended into those tunnels, trusting his employer to maintain safe working conditions. 43 years of breathing whatever chemicals they'd used for dust suppression, wearing equipment that rubbed against skin already compromised by constant exposure to industrial compounds. "Even if that's true," Earl said quietly, "Millbrook Mining closed in 2008. The company doesn't exist anymore. But the parent company does. Allegheny Industries bought them out, then sold the assets when the mine closed. There's got to be liability somewhere." Over the next 3 days, Martha threw herself into research with the dedication of a detective solving a murder case. She contacted former miners, tracked down medical records, and discovered a pattern that made Earl's stomach turn. 17 former Millbrook mining employees had been diagnosed with various forms of skin cancer over the past 5 years. 5 had died. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tom Bradley, Earl's former shift supervisor, called on Thursday evening with information that would change everything. "Earl, you need to know something." Tom's gravelly voice carried the weight of 40 years underground. "I've been talking to some of the other guys, the ones still alive anyway. We all worked the deep shafts, remember? The ones where they used that new chemical treatment starting in '75? Earl remembered. The company had introduced a revolutionary dust suppression system that year, spraying the tunnel walls with a chemical compound that supposedly made working conditions safer. They'd been told it was non-toxic, a breakthrough in mining safety that would protect them from black lung disease. "What about it, Tom?" "I kept some of the old safety sheets, the ones they made us sign, acknowledging we'd been trained on the new procedures. Been going through them since my diagnosis last month. Yeah, I got it too, Earl. Anyway, I found something interesting in the fine print." Tom's pause stretched long enough that Earl wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, his old supervisor continued, his voice thick with emotion. "The chemical compound, XR47 they called it, was manufactured by Chemtech Industries. Guess what I found when I looked up Chemtech on the internet? They were shut down by the EPA in 1989 for manufacturing industrial chemicals later found to be carcinogenic. The stuff we were breathing every day for 14 years was literally poison, Earl, and somebody had to know." Earl sank into Rose's old rocking chair, the phone trembling in his hands. 14 years of exposure from 1975 to 1989 when the company quietly switched to a different suppression system without explanation. 14 years of trusting his employer with his life only to discover they'd been slowly poisoning him and his co-workers. Tom, we need to do something about this. We can't let them get away with killing our friends. Already started, Earl. I've contacted a lawyer in Charleston, guy named David Brennan, who specializes in occupational exposure cases. He's interested, real interested. Says we might have grounds for a class action lawsuit if we can prove the company knew the chemicals were dangerous. That night, Earl barely slept. He stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the dark mountains that had defined his entire life, thinking about the men who'd worked beside him in those tunnels. Good men with families, men who'd trusted their employer just as he had, men who were dying now because someone in a corporate boardroom had decided their lives were worth less than the cost of safer chemicals. By morning, Earl Thompson had made a decision that would change not only his own fate but the lives of hundreds of families across West Virginia. He would fight, not just for his own survival, but for justice for every man who'd been betrayed by the company they'd served faithfully for decades. The war against Allegheny Industries was about to begin. The law offices of Brennan Associates occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Capitol Street in Charleston, its ornate cornices and wraparound porch a stark contrast to the gleaming corporate towers that dominated the city's skyline. David Brennan himself was nothing like the smooth-talking ambulance chasers Earl had seen on television commercials. At 55, he carried the weathered look of someone who'd grown up working class, his hands still bearing calluses from his younger days as a construction worker before putting himself through law school. "Mr. Thompson, I've been reviewing your case along with the others Mr. Bradley brought to my attention," Brennan said, settling behind a desk cluttered with medical reports and legal documents. "What we have here isn't just medical malpractice, it's criminal negligence on a massive scale." Earl sat across from the lawyer, Martha beside him, taking notes with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to documenting important information. The staging scans had confirmed Dr. Chen's worst fears. The melanoma had spread to 3 lymph nodes, pushing Earl into Stage 3 classification. Surgery was scheduled for the following week. But even with successful treatment, his 5-year survival rate had dropped to 60%. "The evidence is damning," Brennan continued, spreading photographs and documents across his desk like a prosecutor laying out evidence for a jury. Chemtech Industries knew as early as 1972 that XR47 caused skin cancer in laboratory animals. They buried the studies and continued selling the product for 17 more years. The photographs showed pages from internal Chemtech memos, their corporate letterhead stamped with "Confidential" in red ink. Earl's hands trembled as he read the casual, businesslike language that had sealed his fate and that of his co-workers. Acceptable risk levels, one memo called the cancer rates among test animals. Cost-benefit analysis favorable to continued production, another concluded. "But Chemtech's gone out of business," Martha pointed out. "How does that help Dad and the other miners?" "Chemtech was owned by Petrolux Corporation, which is still very much in business," Brennan explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who'd found his prey's trail. "When Chemtech was dissolved, Petrolux absorbed all assets and liabilities. More importantly, we've discovered that Allegheny Industries, the company that owned Millbrook Mining, received safety reports about XR47 as early as 1976 and chose to continue using it." The lawyer pulled out a manila folder thick with medical records. "I've identified 47 former Millbrook Mining employees who've been diagnosed with various cancers over the past decade. 17 with skin cancer, 12 with lung cancer, 8 with bladder cancer, and 10 with other malignancies, all consistent with XR47 exposure patterns documented in the buried Chemtech studies." Earl stared at the list of names, recognizing faces from decades of shared shifts underground. Jimmy Patterson, dead at 68 from lung cancer. Mike Santos, fighting bladder cancer with no insurance. Eddie Kowalski, buried last year after his skin cancer spread to his liver. These weren't statistics, they were his friends, his brothers in every way that mattered. "What are we looking at in terms of compensation?" Martha asked, though Earl could see she was struggling to reduce human suffering to dollar amounts. "If we can prove corporate knowledge and deliberate cover-up, we're looking at significant punitive damages in addition to medical costs and pain and suffering," Brennan said. "For the estate representatives, the families of those who've already passed, we're talking wrongful death settlements that could reach 7 figures each." The number hung in the air like smoke, almost incomprehensible to Earl's Depression-era mindset. 7 figures. Millions of dollars. Enough to ensure Martha's children could attend college, enough to guarantee his own medical care, enough to matter. But the path to justice wouldn't be easy. Over the following weeks, Earl's life became a whirlwind of medical appointments, legal depositions, and media interviews. The surgery to remove the melanoma and affected lymph nodes left him weak and scarred, but Dr. Chen's prognosis remained cautiously optimistic. The cancer appeared contained, though he would need regular monitoring and possible chemotherapy if any suspicious cells returned. Brennan had filed a massive class action lawsuit against both Allegheny Industries and Petrolux Corporation, seeking $2 billion in damages for the affected miners and their families. The case immediately attracted national attention, with investigative reporters descending on Millbrook like locusts, turning Earl's quiet neighborhood into a media circus. "Corporate America has been poisoning working people for decades," declared Sarah Williams, the investigative journalist from the Charleston Gazette whose series on mining industry cover-ups had won a Pulitzer Prize the previous year. "The Millbrook case represents everything wrong with how companies prioritize profits over human lives." Earl found himself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight, his weathered face appearing on television screens across the country as news networks picked up the story. CNN ran a segment titled "Betrayed Underground: The Millbrook Mining Scandal." Fox News featured a panel discussion about corporate accountability. Even the New York Times sent a reporter to interview him on his front porch, the same porch where he'd sat with Rose for nearly 50 years. "I never wanted to be famous," Earl told Martha one evening as they watched protesters gather outside Allegheny Industries' corporate headquarters in Pittsburgh on the evening news. "I just wanted justice for the boys who didn't make it." But fame, wanted or not, brought both opportunities and challenges. Supporters from across the country began sending letters and small donations to help with Earl's medical expenses. A GoFundMe page set up by Martha's twins raised $40,000 in 2 weeks. Churches in mining communities throughout Appalachia held fundraisers and prayer vigils. The corporate response was swift and ruthless. Allegheny Industries hired Morrison, Price Associates, one of the country's most prestigious defense firms, to fight the lawsuit. Their strategy became clear during Earl's deposition, held in a sterile conference room that smelled of leather and expensive cologne. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it true that you smoked cigarettes for 15 years before quitting in 1982? Asked Patricia Morrison, the lead defense attorney whose sharp suit and sharper tongue had intimidated hundreds of plaintiffs over her 30-year career. "That's correct," Earl answered, glancing at Brennan for reassurance. "And isn't it true that cigarette smoking is a known cause of various cancers, including skin cancer?" "Objection," Brennan interjected. "Counsel is misrepresenting established medical science. Cigarette smoking is not associated with melanoma." "Sustained," ruled the court reporter, but Earl could see the defense strategy clearly. They would try to muddy the waters, suggest that lifestyle choices rather than occupational exposure had caused the miners' cancers. The attacks grew more personal as the case gained momentum. Private investigators appeared in Millbrook, interviewing Earl's neighbors and former co-workers, looking for anything that might undermine his credibility. Anonymous phone calls threatened him to drop the lawsuit. Someone spray-painted "liar" across his garage door. "They're trying to break you down," Brennan warned during one of their strategy sessions. Corporate defendants always go after the lead plaintiffs personally, hoping to discredit them or force them to withdraw. But Earl had survived 43 years underground, had weathered Rose's death and his own cancer diagnosis. He wasn't about to be intimidated by corporate bullies, no matter how expensive their lawyers were. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Marcus Webb, a former Chemtech research scientist, contacted Brennan's office with information that would change everything. Webb had worked on the original XR-47 safety studies in the early 1970s and had kept copies of all the suppressed research data for nearly 50 years. "I was young and scared back then," Webb explained during a videotaped interview in Brennan's office. "When the company ordered us to bury the cancer studies, I thought about blowing the whistle, but I had a family to support. I've regretted that decision every day since." Webb's evidence was devastating. Internal memos showed that Chemtech executives had known about XR-47's carcinogenic properties for years before selling it to mining companies. More damning still, documents proved that Allegheny Industries had received detailed safety warnings about the chemical in 1976, but had continued using it until 1989 to avoid the cost of switching to safer alternatives. "We're looking at corporate executives who literally chose to poison their own workers to save money," Brennan told the media at a packed press conference. "This isn't about negligence anymore. It's about deliberate, criminal disregard for human life." As the evidence mounted, public opinion shifted decisively in favor of the miners. Editorial writers across the country condemned the corporate cover-up. Labor unions organized boycotts of Allegheny Industries products. Congressional representatives called for hearings on occupational safety enforcement. But for Earl, sitting in his living room each evening as his strength slowly returned, the real victory wouldn't be measured in dollars or headlines. It would be measured in the other miners' families who might finally get the justice they deserved, and in the knowledge that Rose would have been proud of him for standing up when it mattered most. The war was far from over, but for the first time since that terrible day in Dr. Chen's office, Earl Thompson dared to believe they might actually win. August brought the kind of oppressive heat that made the mountains shimmer like mirages, and with it came the crushing weight of Earl's deteriorating condition. The surgery had seemed successful at first. Dr. Chen had removed the primary tumor and 3 affected lymph nodes with cautious optimism. But cancer, Earl was learning, followed no man's schedule and respected no doctor's predictions. The first sign of trouble came during a routine follow-up appointment. Dr. Chen's face had changed as she studied the latest CT scans, her professional composure slipping just enough for Earl to recognize the look he'd seen in mining supervisors' eyes when equipment failure threatened lives underground. "Mr. Thompson, I'm afraid we have some complications," she said, her voice carefully measured. "The scans show suspicious activity in your liver and lungs. We need to do a biopsy immediately." Martha's hand found his across the examination table, her fingers cold despite the summer heat. Earl had seen enough death in the mines to recognize the signs. The way doctors' voices got softer, the way they started talking about comfort measures and quality of life. The cancer had spread, probably while he'd been fighting corporate lawyers instead of focusing on his health. The biopsy confirmed what they'd all feared. Stage 4 metastatic melanoma, with tumors in his liver, lungs, and possibly his brain. Dr. Chen spoke about aggressive chemotherapy protocols and experimental treatments, but Earl could read between the lines. At 76, with his body already weakened by decades of mining and recent surgery, his chances had dropped to statistical insignificance. How long? Earl asked directly, the same way he'd always preferred bad news delivered underground, straight and honest, without sugarcoating. With treatment, possibly 6 to 18 months. Without treatment, Dr. Chen trailed off, but Earl understood. Maybe 3 months, maybe less. The financial implications were as devastating as the medical ones. The experimental treatments Dr. Chen recommended would cost over $300,000 with no guarantee of success. Earl's Medicare would cover basic palliative care, but the cutting-edge therapies that offered his only real hope remained financially out of reach. "I can't ask Martha to mortgage her future for a few extra months," Earl told Brennan during an emergency meeting at the lawyer's office. "She's got her kids to think about, their college educations. I won't leave my family bankrupt just to buy time." But Brennan had other concerns. "Earl, if your condition worsens, it could seriously damage our case. The defense will argue that we can't prove the cancer caused your death if you don't pursue all available treatments. They'll claim you gave up, that other factors contributed to the outcome." The cruel irony wasn't lost on Earl. The very lawsuit that was supposed to provide justice might collapse if he couldn't afford the treatment that would keep him alive long enough to see it through. Corporate lawyers would twist his inability to pay for experimental therapy into evidence that his cancer wasn't as serious as claimed. The community rallied around Earl with the fierce loyalty that defined small mining towns. The Millbrook Methodist Church organized bake sales and car washes. The VFW Post held fish fries every Friday, donating proceeds to Earl's medical fund. His former co-workers, many struggling with their own health problems and financial difficulties, contributed what they could from fixed incomes and disability checks. Jake and Emma, Martha's twins, expanded their online fundraising efforts with the technological savvy of their generation. Their GoFundMe page went viral after a video they posted showing Earl's daily struggle with cancer while fighting for justice. Within days, donations poured in from across the country, $10 from a retired teacher in Ohio, $50 from a union worker in Detroit, $100 from a mining family in Wyoming who'd faced their own corporate betrayal. But even with the community support, the financial mountain seemed impossible to climb. Earl's medical bills exceeded $200,000 and climbing, while his treatment fund barely reached $60,000. The mathematics of survival had become a cruel equation that no amount of goodwill could balance. The lawsuit itself faced increasing pressure as defense lawyers exploited every weakness they could find. Private investigators had uncovered Earl's brief experimentation with chewing tobacco in his 20s, a fact that Morrison's team seized upon to muddy the cancer causation arguments. They hired expert witnesses who testified that lifestyle factors and genetic predisposition, not occupational exposure, were the most likely causes of his melanoma. "They're systematically destroying the credibility of every plaintiff," Brennan confided during a late-night phone call. "Earl, I have to be honest with you. The defense is playing for time, hoping that enough plaintiffs will die or withdraw that the case falls apart. They're betting they can outlast us." The emotional toll on Martha was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire ordeal. Earl watched his daughter work double shifts at the hospital to pay for his care while managing her own household and supporting the lawsuit effort. She'd aged 10 years in 6 months, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry lines that reminded him painfully of Rose during her final illness. "Dad, I found a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins," Martha said one evening, her voice carrying forced optimism. "They're testing a new immunotherapy protocol. It's experimental, but the early results look promising." Earl studied the papers she'd printed from the internet, research abstracts filled with medical terminology he didn't understand. The trial was free, but it required him to relocate to Baltimore for 6 months of treatment, leaving behind everything familiar while his body endured another round of chemical warfare against the cancer. "What are the side effects?" he asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. severe nausea, fatigue, possible neurological complications. Dad, it's going to be rough, but it might be our only shot. That night, Earl sat in Rose's garden under a sky full of stars, listening to the night sounds of the mountains he'd called home for 76 years. The tomatoes were ripening heavy on the vine, probably the last crop he'd see in this garden. The American flag on his front porch hung limp in the still air, a symbol of values that felt increasingly hollow in the face of corporate indifference to human suffering. The hardest part wasn't facing his own mortality. Earl had made peace with death years ago when Rose passed. The hardest part was watching his family sacrifice everything for treatments that might only prolong his suffering without changing the ultimate outcome. Martha was draining her retirement savings. Jake and Emma were considering community college instead of the universities they dreamed of attending, all to buy him a few more months of painful existence. "Rose," he whispered to the darkness, "I don't know what to do anymore. These corporate bastards are willing to let me die just to avoid paying what they owe, and my family's destroying themselves trying to keep me alive long enough to see justice." What would you do? The only answer was the whisper of wind through the trees, carrying the scent of coal dust and memories from the valley below. But as Earl sat there in the garden his wife had loved, surrounded by the mountains that had defined his entire life, he realized that sometimes the greatest act of love was knowing when to let go, and when to fight harder than you'd ever fought before. The next morning, Earl Thompson made a decision that would change the trajectory of both his life and the lawsuit that had consumed his final months. It was a decision that Rose would have understood, even if it broke Martha's heart. He was going to Baltimore, not for the experimental treatment, but to make one final stand in the courtroom where the real battle for justice would be decided. If he was going to die, he was going to die fighting, ensuring that the corporate executives who'd poisoned him and his friends would finally face the consequences of their greed. The war was entering its final phase, and Earl Thompson wasn't giving up without a fight. The Baltimore Federal Courthouse stood like a monument to justice on North Calvert Street, its neoclassical columns and marble steps suggesting permanence and fairness that Earl hoped still existed in America's legal system. October's crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves as he climbed those steps, leaning heavily on Martha's arm, his body ravaged by 3 months of aggressive chemotherapy that had bought him time but exacted a terrible price. Judge Margaret Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, presided over the consolidated class action lawsuit that would determine the fate of 47 miners and their families. The courtroom was packed with reporters, mining families, and corporate executives in expensive suits who looked supremely confident in their ability to outlast a dying old man and his small-town lawyer. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Allegheny Industries and Petrolux Corporation engaged in a decades-long conspiracy to hide the deadly effects of XR-47 from the workers who trusted them with their lives, David Brennan declared in his opening statement, his voice carrying across the hushed courtroom. They turned these men's workplaces into death chambers, and when the bodies started piling up, they hired armies of lawyers to deny responsibility. Patricia Morrison's response was clinical and devastating. Your Honor, the plaintiffs are asking this court to ignore basic principles of medical causation and scientific evidence. These men worked in inherently dangerous environments for decades, exposed to countless potential carcinogens. To blame their illnesses on a single chemical based on speculation and emotion rather than solid science would set a dangerous precedent that could destroy American industry. Earl sat in the front row of the gallery, watching the legal choreography unfold with the same analytical eye he'd once used to assess dangerous mining conditions. The defense had clearly done their homework, assembling a team of expert witnesses who challenged every aspect of the plaintiff's case. Dr. Richard Steinberg, a toxicologist from Harvard, testified that the cancer patterns among the miners were consistent with normal statistical variation in the population. Correlation does not equal causation, Dr. Steinberg explained to the jury in the condescending tone academics used when addressing ordinary people. While these men's illnesses are certainly tragic, there's no compelling scientific evidence linking them to XR47 exposure. But Brennan had prepared for this battle, Dr. Marcus Webb's testimony proved explosive, his detailed recollections of the suppressed safety studies providing a roadmap to corporate malfeasance. Webb, now 71 and suffering from his own health problems, spoke with the authority of someone unburdening his conscience after decades of silence. We knew by 1973 that XR47 caused aggressive skin cancers in laboratory animals, Webb testified, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the courtroom's sound system. When I reported these findings to management, I was told to reconsider my conclusions. When I refused, they buried the studies and transferred me to another project. The corporate memos Webb had preserved for nearly 50 years created a sensation in the courtroom. Internal communications between Chemtech and Allegheny Industries revealed a callous disregard for worker safety that shocked even the experienced reporters covering the trial. One memo, dated 1976, discussed acceptable casualty rates among miners as if they were military assets rather than human beings. Earl's own testimony, scheduled for the trial's climactic moment, nearly didn't happen. The night before he was scheduled to take the stand, his condition deteriorated dramatically. Martha found him collapsed in their Baltimore hotel room, barely conscious and running a high fever from chemotherapy-induced infections. "Dad, we need to get you to the hospital," Martha urged, but Earl gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Tomorrow, after I testify," he whispered. "I didn't come this far to quit now." The next morning, supported by 2 bailiffs and connected to a portable oxygen tank, Earl Thompson took the witness stand. His appearance shocked the courtroom. The robust miner who'd begun the lawsuit 8 months earlier had been reduced to a skeletal figure weighing barely 130 pounds, his skin gray and eyes sunken. But his voice, when he began to speak, carried the authority of a man who'd spent his life telling the truth. "43 years I worked those tunnels," Earl began, his words measured and clear despite his physical frailty. 43 years I trusted Allegheny Industries to keep me safe. They told us XR47 was the latest in safety technology, that it would protect us from black lung disease. What they didn't tell us was that they were trading one death sentence for another. Patricia Morrison's cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective. Earl's straightforward responses and obvious suffering made her legal maneuvering appear callous and desperate. When she suggested that his cancer might have been caused by lifestyle choices, Earl's response silenced the courtroom. "Ma'am, I never smoked cigarettes regularly, never drank more than a beer on Saturday nights, and never worked anywhere but Millbrook Mining from the day I graduated high school. The only thing that makes sense is that the company I gave my life to was slowly poisoning me every day I went underground." The defense's case began to unravel when Dr. Elizabeth Chen took the stand as an expert witness for the plaintiffs. Her analysis of the cancer patterns among Millbrook miners was devastating to the defense's statistical arguments. In a normal population of this size, we would expect to see perhaps 2 or 3 cases of melanoma over a 20-year period, Dr. Chen testified. The fact that we've identified 17 cases, all among workers exposed to XR47, represents a statistical impossibility unless there's a common causative factor. But the trial's most dramatic moment came when Thomas Morrison, Patricia Morrison's own son and a Petrolux Corporation executive, was called as a hostile witness. The young lawyer had discovered evidence that his own law firm had helped cover up the XR-47 studies, creating a conflict of interest that threatened to destroy both the defense case and his family's reputation. "Mr. Morrison, are you aware that your law firm represented Chemtech Industries during the period when they were suppressing cancer studies?" Brennan asked during a tense examination. Morrison's answer, barely audible, sent shockwaves through the courtroom. "Yes, sir. We advised them on strategies to minimize legal liability while continuing to market XR-47. The admission created chaos in the courtroom and effectively ended the defense's case. Patricia Morrison was forced to recuse herself, leaving Allegheny Industries' legal team in disarray. More importantly, Thomas Morrison's testimony provided the final piece of evidence proving that the corporate defendants had knowingly poisoned the miners while actively working to hide the evidence. As the trial concluded, Earl sat in the gallery one final time, watching as the jury filed out to deliberate. His breathing had become increasingly labored, and Martha had arranged for a hospice bed to be set up in their hotel suite. The experimental chemotherapy had failed, and his doctors estimated he had perhaps days rather than weeks remaining. "Dad, you did it," Martha whispered, holding his hand as they waited for the verdict. "Whatever happens with the jury, you've already won. The whole country knows what these companies did to you and the other miners." Earl nodded weakly, his eyes fixed on the empty jury box where 12 ordinary Americans would soon decide whether corporate profits mattered more than human lives. He thought about Rose, about the garden he'd never see again, about the mountains of West Virginia where he'd been born and raised and learned the meaning of honest work. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, returning with a verdict that would reshape corporate accountability in America. As the foreman stood to read their decision, Earl Thompson closed his eyes and prepared to hear whether his life's final battle had been won or lost. Outside the courthouse windows, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing Baltimore in white silence that reminded Earl of the mountains he called home. Win or lose, his fight was nearly over. But the ripple effects of his courage would continue long after he was gone, ensuring that other working families might never face the betrayal that had consumed his final year. The foreman cleared his throat and began to read the verdict that would either vindicate Earl Thompson's sacrifice or condemn it to legal footnote status. The packed courtroom held its breath, waiting to learn whether justice still existed in America. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiffs and award damages in the amount of $2.3 billion. The courtroom erupted in gasps, tears, and scattered applause as the foreman's words echoed through the marble halls of justice. Earl felt Martha's hand squeeze his so tightly he thought his bones might break, but he barely noticed. After 43 years of loyal service and 8 months of brutal legal warfare, justice had finally spoken. Patricia Morrison's replacement sat stunned at the defense table, frantically scribbling notes while corporate executives whispered urgent instructions. $2.3 billion, the largest occupational health settlement in West Virginia history. Earl's portion alone would exceed $4 million, enough to secure Martha's family for generations. But the victory felt bittersweet. Earl had won the war, but lost the battle for his own life. The experimental treatments had failed, and Dr. Chen estimated he had perhaps 2 weeks remaining. Still, as he watched Martha weep tears of relief and vindication, he knew Rose would have been proud of what they'd accomplished. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented. CNN ran the story as breaking news. Dying miner wins $2.3 billion from corporate giants. The New York Times featured Earl's photograph on the front page under the headline, "David Defeats Goliath in Corporate America." But Earl barely noticed the attention. His energy was focused on getting home to West Virginia one last time. 3 days after the verdict, Earl Thompson passed away peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by 3 generations of family. Martha held his hand as his breathing grew shallow, whispering the names of all the miners whose justice he'd secured. Jake and Emma sat at the foot of the bed, quietly playing the guitar songs their grandfather had taught them. Outside, the October mountains blazed with autumn colors that reminded everyone why Earl had fought so hard to come home. The funeral drew over 1,000 mourners to Millbrook Methodist Church. Mining families from across Appalachia came to pay respects to the man who'd stood up to corporate America and won. Senators and congressmen delivered eulogies. The governor of West Virginia declared Earl Thompson Day to honor his courage. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from an unexpected source. Thomas Morrison, the young lawyer whose testimony had helped seal the case, resigned from his family's firm and established a non-profit legal clinic specializing in occupational health cases. The Earl Thompson Foundation, funded by his settlement money, provided free medical care to miners and their families across the region. Martha, now financially secure for the first time in her adult life, reduced her hospital hours to spend time with her children and manage the foundation. Jake and Emma both earned full scholarships to prestigious universities, their grandfather's sacrifice ensuring they'd never face the financial hardships that had defined previous generations. The Millbrook mining disaster had claimed its final victim, but Earl Thompson's legacy lived on in the lives he'd saved and the justice he'd secured. Sometimes David really could defeat Goliath, if he was willing to pay the ultimate price for victory. Earl Thompson's story isn't just about one man's fight against corporate greed, it's about the values that define our generation. At 76, Earl could have quietly accepted his fate, could have spared his family the financial burden and emotional turmoil of fighting giants like Allegheny Industries. But he chose a different path, the same path our parents and grandparents walked when they built this country with their bare hands and unshakable principles. Like Earl, we've spent our lives believing that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded, that companies would honor the trust we placed in them. We've watched our neighborhoods change, our industries disappear, and our children struggle with challenges we never imagined. But Earl's victory reminds us that it's never too late to stand up for what's right, never too late to fight for the people we love. His legacy lives on in the Earl Thompson Foundation, in Martha's children attending college debt-free, and in the thousands of mining families who finally received justice. Earl proved that one person with courage and family support can still change the world, even at the end of life's journey. What corporate betrayal have you witnessed in your lifetime that still makes your blood boil? Have you ever had to choose between your principles and financial security like Earl did? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters and could inspire others to find their own courage.